Not every book should be reread, and that's why today I wanted to share with you a handful of books that I never plan on revisiting, even though I absolutely loved them at the time that I originally read them. And I have a couple of reasons for this. The biggest one being is that I just don't want to ruin the way that I look at the book. Sometimes you pick up a book at the perfect time in your life, and it hits a certain way. You absolutely love it because you were just meant to read it at that time. But over time, you eventually mature and your tastes change and you get more critical, and the book just might not live up to the way that you currently need it to. So therefore, I just kind of want to protect the reading experience that I originally had with it. And I don't want to alter the way that I look at these stories because I just know that I won't like them as much the second time around. So that is kind of how I chose the books for today's video. And with that said, let's get into all of them. So a perfect example for this is actually the From Blood and Ash series by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So I had originally picked this book up when there were only 3 books out in the series. I was just coming off of my first round of reading all of the Sarah J. Maas books, and I just wanted another fantasy romance series that was going to make me feel the same things that the ACOTAR and the Throne of Glass series had made me feel. And everybody was saying, try From Blood and Ash. I'm telling you, it's gonna give you the same feel. So you know what? I did. I listened to them, and I ended up being blown away by it. And I was a really big fan of these books for a very long time. And then around a year or so later, the 4th book in the series was coming out, and I'm like, you know what? I absolutely loved this series. I always wanted to revisit it because I just had such a good time with it the first time around. So why don't I do a reread of the first 3 to get myself prepared for the 4th book? And that ended up being one of the biggest mistakes I have ever done because I loved this series the first time that I read it. But then when I went and revisited it, I started to pick up on so much more about how it was being built up, how the story was being laid out, and just a lot of things about it that I didn't notice when I was just reading it for the first time. And it ended up making me absolutely hate the series. I have talked about this many times on my channel before, so I won't go into too much detail, but I noticed a lot about how the world was being built up, and I wasn't a fan of it. I just was not enjoying how we were getting the information. And I also just wasn't as much of a fan of the romance in general as I thought I was from the first time that I read it. So I completely ended up screwing up how I look at this series, and now I actually no longer care how it even ends. It's not even a completed series, and I never plan on even finishing up with it as each book comes out. So this is a great example of a book where I actually ended up rereading it and I very much regretted it, and that is why I'm trying to not make that mistake again, because if I didn't revisit this book, I probably still would have been a huge fan of it. So with that said, another series that I tried revisiting at one point, but quickly realized that I'm making a mistake by doing that, is the All Souls Trilogy by Deborah Harkness. So this is one of the first fantasy romance series that I picked up when I was getting myself back into reading. It's an urban fantasy with vampires, witches, and demons all living amongst humans, but humans have no idea that they're all living among them. And one of the biggest things is that there's a forbidden romance between a witch and a vampire. They're not really supposed to mingle, like you're supposed to stay in your sex of supernatural, but they end up falling in love anyway, and then it's like a forbidden romance between them with a lot of politics and other things going on. And even as I'm telling you about this, I still remember all the good feelings that I had towards this series, so much to the point that last year, around 2 years or so after I had first picked this series up, I decided that I really wanted to revisit it because I just loved it so much at the time that I originally read it. But then when I started doing that, I realized that I'm just not enjoying it as much the second time around. So I decided to stop myself early so that I don't skew up too much of how I look at the overall trilogy, and I only reread the first book. So I'm very happy that I kind of learned my lesson from Blood and Ash, and I didn't ruin this book so much to the point that I can no longer say like, oh yeah, I'm not a fan of it. So now I look at this book still with fond memories, but I can never go back to it because I know that I tried it once and it did not work out that great. So yeah, lesson learned. Next, I wanted to talk about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So this is a book that is extremely popular. I remember right when it came out, it was getting sold out after sold out. Like they were making prints, sold out instantly, on the bestsellers list for months and months, and it was just all over the place. And that is why even to this day, it is an extremely, extremely popular book. But happens to be, I had picked it up before all of that hype really started. Like I literally bought it from the store the day that it came out. I remember seeing a couple of things about it, like about how people were really excited for it to come out, but I didn't really know what it was about. And then I was literally in a Target on the day of its release, and I got very lucky to snag a copy. I'm like, I recognize that cover. Let's pick it up and see what it's about. So I brought it home without really knowing much about it, without having seen any reviews about it whatsoever. And then I ended up being absolutely blown away by it. And I was a huge fan of it for a very long time. But then the more popular that it got over time, some more negative reviews started coming out about it, and people started being really critical about what this story was because of how much hype it was getting. They're like, is this worth the hype? Is it actually as good as everybody's saying it is? Stuff like that. And then I started seeing some people's negative reviews, and then I'm like, you know what? I didn't really notice that at the time that I read it, but I see what you're saying. And then I kind of like accumulated a lot of negative thoughts towards this book, even though I personally did not feel that way at all when I read it, because I just had no ulterior thoughts whatsoever, and I just enjoyed it for what it was in the moment that I had picked it up originally. And now that I think it's been a lot of years since its release, as in since the first time that I read it, and now that I have all of these ulterior thoughts in my mind about it, I really think that I would end up going into it a lot more critical than I did the first time around, and I would pick up on a lot of the things that everybody said bad about it. And that's why I don't think that I can actually ever revisit this book, even though it still might be as good the second time around for me. Like, I don't know, but I don't really want to test that theory because I remember having such good thoughts towards it, and I don't want to see if all of those negative feelings that other people had end up like, working out for me. Does that make sense? I think it does. So either way, that's the reason why, even though I love this book so freaking much, I am never going to revisit it. And then very similar timeline to The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. So I definitely picked this book up at around the same time that I picked up Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I don't remember exactly when this came out, if it was a new release at the time that I picked it up or whatever the story was, but I was very into my, like, I'm reading anything that other people are recommending phase. Like, I was just getting myself into reading. I was down to try anything, and I was seeing a lot of good stuff about this. So I'm like, you know what? Let's give it a shot, especially because it is a standalone fantasy book, which is something that I feel like I never really came across very often and still never come across very often. So I ended up picking up, and I was warned that I have to go into it with an extremely open mind because the author's writing is very different than you're probably used to. So I kind of went into it with no expectations whatsoever, and I ended up absolutely loving it. And the thing is that at the time that I read it, I was in a very experimental stage where almost anything was working for me, and that is definitely not the case anymore. Like, now I'm way too critical, I'm way too picky, and I just know that if I went back to this book, I would pick up on a lot more things than I originally noticed about it, and I don't think that I would enjoy it as much as I did the first time around. So this is one of those books that I just want to preserve how I feel about this book and how I look at this book. So even though I might like it the second time around, I'm not going to test that theory. Next, I wanted to share The Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson. So this is a YA fantasy romance trilogy, and I had picked this book up kind of like at the same time as I picked up all of the previous books we've talked about before, where I just had no critical eye whatsoever, and more or less anything was working for me because I was reading everything for the first time. Like, this happened to be a love triangle, but I was reading it before I even realized what a love triangle was. So I had found it really fun and really entertaining, and I was just a fan of the whole trilogy from beginning to end. But now that I've developed my taste over time, and I've also started to notice what things actually are, like, right when you start reading, you don't actually know what tropes are, you don't actually know what you're looking out for, you don't really understand the idea of like plot building and things along those lines. You pick that up over time after reading a lot, and this is one of those books that I had read before I picked up on any of that, and I just have a really large feeling that if I did go back to it now, I wouldn't enjoy it as much because first and foremost is that I'm no longer a fan of love triangles, and even though I remember liking it at the time that I read this trilogy, I do think that it was one of the building blocks to make me realize that love triangles are just not my favorite for a very long list of reasons. So because of the love triangle and just the fact that it's like a YA fantasy series, and I don't really like reading YA so much anymore, I don't think that I would enjoy this as much the second time around. So I much rather preserve my feelings towards this series and never revisit it. And the last series that I wanted to share with you for today's video is the Ravenhood series by Kate Stewart. So this is a series that had me in quite a chokehold for a while there, and I still do consider it a favorite romance series of mine, even though I know that I will not enjoy it as much the second time around, and I can never actually revisit it. But the feelings that I had towards it at the time that I read it are still so strong and vivid in my mind that I will forever look back on this series with very good memories. But now that time has passed, I don't think that I would enjoy it as much as I did, because I have gotten more critical and I have seen a lot of negative things that people have said about this series, and I don't per se disagree with them, even though I didn't really pick up on it at the time that I read it. And then happens to be on top of that, one of the biggest things about this series in general is that it's one of those stories that as you read it, you slowly find out what's actually happening. And I think that that was a really big part of why I enjoyed the series, kind of like being in the unknowing and then slowly figuring it out. And obviously now that I know how it's going to end, I'm not going to be able to have the same experience with it. So even though I still have very fond memories towards this, and all of the negative reviews that I have seen about it over time hasn't really like diminished how I feel about it, I don't really want to mess with my original experience with it, and therefore I'm never going to revisit it. So that is everything that I wanted to share with you for today's video. So I am so curious to hear if, first of all, are you a fan of rereading books in general or not? Because I know that it's kind of like a very like divided thing. Some people, they're like one and done, and some people can reread things over and over again. And then if you are a fan of rereading books, do you have any books that you never plan on revisiting, even though you really enjoy them the first time around? So leave me a comment down below if you have something to share. But either way, if you enjoyed watching this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also subscribe to my channel if you're not currently subscribed, because I would really appreciate it. But either way, I just appreciate you taking the time to watch my video. So thank you so much for that. So with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.